Well, it's always a good day to take a topic that's been run into the ground and talk about it a little bit more. So that's what we're going to do here today on the Tuesday edition of the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. You've already seen the headlines, so you know what we're going to talk about. You know it's not on-campus stadiums. You know it's not uniforms, although they kind of resolved that. We have to dig deep to complain about uniforms these days. I can still do it because they had a perfect uniform with the retro uniforms that they wore in 2016 and 17 and 18 before they came out with the new uniforms, the ones they wear now in 2019. And they had a perfect uniform with those retros from 2016 to 2018. And there was no need to change that. They should have just made that the regular uniform. See, we could still talk about uniforms. There's still plenty of opportunities to complain about uniforms, but that's not what we're doing today. We're not talking about on-campus stadiums. We're not talking about uniforms. We're talking about the third piece of the holy triumvirate of Pitt fan complaints and beaten to death topics, recruiting the WPIAL. It's always a favorite. Now, look. Is there anything new to say about recruiting the WPIAL? Not necessarily, but every year brings a new recruiting class. Every year brings a new group of guys. So let's look at some of the guys Pitt's after in the WPIAL this year. Let's talk about Pitt's chances of landing those guys in the WPIAL this year. And let's look overall at what is going on with Pitt in the WPIAL, what's been going on with Pitt in the WPIAL, and why Pitt does or doesn't have success locally. And some different things. Look, I got the legal pad out to try and do a little research. So, we got some new things to maybe add to the conversation. Something you can bring up at the tailgate in the fall about Pitt recruiting in the WPIAL and how they've done with guys, basically under Pat Narduzzi. We'll go back that far, which is basically 10 full recruiting classes back to the class of 2016. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about where Pitt is in the WPIAL, where Pitt stands with the WPIAL this year, and what might be lying ahead. What's come before and what's lying ahead for Pitt recruiting local prospects, Western PA. It's a little Tuesday conversation about WPIAL recruiting here on the Morning Pitt. youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. All right, it's Tuesday here on the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com. Glad you could tune in this morning to hang out and talk a little bit of Pitt sports. I say tune in this morning. We released the video in the morning. Maybe you're watching in the afternoon. Maybe you're watching in the evening. Maybe you're watching on Wednesday. I don't know what it is, but I appreciate you tuning in for it. While you're here, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. And then, of course, check out the website, Panther-Lair.com. It's our Pitt sports site on the 24/7 Sports Network. And, we'll talk here for 15 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever about WPIAL recruiting. But the reality is all the info and more in-depth conversation is happening on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com. So if you're a Pitt fan, you want to get involved with the best online Pitt community, the place to do it is at Panther-Lair.com. So come and hang out at Panther-Lair.com and talk to other Pitt fans about everything going on in the world of Pitt sports. Football, basketball, recruiting, we cover it all at Panther-Lair.com and message boards for the community. It's a lot of fun. All right, so recruiting in the WPIAL. And I bring this up because this spring so far has seen a significant WPIAL presence, at least a significant presence for some of the top targets for Pitt in the, primarily in the 2026 recruiting class. There have been a few guys who have been at multiple practices. They've had 9 practices now. And there are a handful of guys who've shown up multiple times at these practices. There's 2 guys out of Peters Township, Reston Lehman and Lucas Shanafelt. Both are kind of big athletes. Lehman's more of a defensive end. Shanafelt's more of a tight end. They've both been at multiple practices, including Saturday's scrimmage that Pitt held at Acrisure Stadium. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. I'm talking about the scrimmage, not necessarily the recruiting angle. But both of those guys were there, and they've been to at least 1 practice each prior to that, if not 2. I forget the exact count, but I know it was multiple times those guys have been at practice this spring. Ditto for Lincoln Hoke, defensive tackle prospect at North Allegheny. He's been at multiple practices so far this spring. And Jay Timmons, a defensive back at Pine Richland, he's been at practice so far this spring. I think at least once, if not multiple times. So, decent crop of WPIAL guys who all look like top targets for Pitt. I think, Shanafelt, one of the top tight ends on the board for Pitt. Lehman, a top defensive end prospect. Hoke, a top defensive tackle prospect. And Timmons, one of the top DBs. And it's interesting because there's a lot of local DB prospects in this 2026 recruiting class. They're all, there's probably 3 or 4 guys, maybe 5, who are very sort of similar. Timmons is probably Pitt's top target out of that group, but we'll see where that shakes out as far as how Pitt does with him. That's we'll get to that in a second. And so because these guys have been at practice a bunch of times this spring and they've certainly emerged as top targets for Pitt, I thought it'd be interesting to talk. This is why we're talking about the WPIAL today. It didn't just come out of nowhere. 3 of those guys were at Pitt's scrimmage on Saturday. So I said, well, this is relevant. Let's talk about this a little bit. And one of the first things, all right, I guess we should get the disclaimers out of the way, right? Disclaimers just save everybody the time and trouble. No, you can't, and you're not going to build your roster entirely out of the WPIAL. You're not going to build a majority of your roster out of the WPIAL. You're not going to build a third of your roster or a quarter of your roster out of the WPIAL. It's going to be something significantly less than that. It's going to be a couple guys each year, but the bulk of your roster is going to come from out of state. It's going to come from kids in Ohio and kids in Georgia and kids in Florida. And these are all good things because there are good players in those states. And if you can go get the second-tier guy or the third-tier guy in Atlanta or somewhere in Florida, you probably are going to get a pretty good player. And some of the best players Pitt has had over the past few years, really under Panther-Lair, some of the best players, if you think about, make a list of the top 5, top 10 guys, most, if not all of them, are from out of state and outside the WPIAL. Kenny Pickett, Jordan Addison, Izzy Abanikanda, Servassier Dennis, Kyle Lewis, Desmond Reed, Rasheem Biles, like on and on. You have your DeMar Hamlin and you have your MJ Devonshire and your Donovan McMillan and your Paris Ford, although it's interesting that out of those 4 guys or whatever that I just mentioned, half of them are transfers, but we'll set that aside for a second. But the best players, Kalijah Cansey, the guys who have really gotten notoriety, any All-Americans really under Panther-Lair, going back to Quadri Henderson in 2016 was an All-American. And these guys are all out-of-state players. And so we all know that, and we understand that. And then there's the extra complicating factor in 2025 that, most of your success in any given year, or a decent portion of your success in any given year, is going to come from transfers. So lessening the significance of that high school recruiting angle even more. And, by extension, lessening the significance of recruiting the WPIAL even more. So all of those things are true, and we know that to be true. It's been proven time and time again. At the same time, and this is always the other side of that coin, is that if there are good players in your backyard, you should get a bunch of them. You should get as many of them as you can. If they're right here, that makes them something of a priority because they are right here, because they are local players and they're good players. If there are guys in the WPIAL or in Western PA who you feel like can help you win, you should try to go get them, and you should want to get as many of them as you can. So all those things are true. It's not going to sink your program if you miss on a bunch of guys from Western PA, and it's also not going to make your program into a national champion if you land a bunch of guys from Western PA. Whether you lose guys or land them all, local guys, you're still going to have to fill out the roster, A, through the portal, most prominently, and B, in the recruiting class from Ohio, Maryland, New Jersey, Georgia, Florida, and so on and so forth. Texas, they're trying to get in on. And so all those things are true. And we know all those things. I think anybody with half a brain knows all of those things and understands all of those things. And that's why, when I said at the beginning about, we're going to go with a topic we've been beating, that has been beaten to death already. That's the part that has been beaten to death, is that sort of debate back and forth about whether Pitt needs the WPIAL or if they should recruit the WPIAL or whatever. That's the part that's been beaten to death, and we don't need to spend much time on that. We can, everybody knows all of those things that I just said. So let's look at specifically where Pitt stands. And I think when you look at these 4 guys in the WPIAL that Pitt seems to be in the best shape with, Shanafelt and Lehman and Timmons and Hoke, and yeah, Timmons and Hoke are, if those names sound familiar, they are the sons of the former Steeler players. So that's always an interesting connection. But when you look at those 4 guys, they've already gotten them on campus this spring. I think it's a pretty good chance that they'll get all 4 on campus for official visits. Hoke, Lehman, and Shanafelt have scheduled official visits. Timmons hasn't officially announced one yet, but we'll see if something comes out there. And I think it's notable just to get them on campus for official visits, all right? Because this is interesting. This is what I spent some time yesterday kind of researching and going down. Pitt has signed guys out of the WPIAL every year. Like, they get WPIAL and City League guys every year. Some of them, not many guys. 2023, they got Cruz Brookins and Braylon Lovelace. 2022, they got Sean Fitzsimmons. This past year, this 2025 recruiting class freshman, this year they got Shep Turk. They only got one guy. But what's interesting to me is over the years, okay, a couple things. We're going to work in a 10-year time frame here. From the recruiting class of 2016 up until the recruiting class of 2025. It's 10 years, 10 recruiting classes. Pat Narduzzi's 10 full recruiting classes. So obviously we're not considering this 2026 class when we talk about this sample size. And we're not going to count that 2015 class when Narduzzi was first hired, a couple of days after Christmas and had the next 2 months or month and a half to put together the class. The 10 full recruiting classes, 2016 to 25, there were only, by my count, 5 Western PA guys who committed to Pitt after taking their official visits. And I bring this up, there's sort of 2 angles here. One, the Western PA guys who committed to Pitt after taking their official visits. And 2, the Western PA guys who took an official visit to Pitt but did not end up committing to Pitt. And these 2 parts of the 2 sides of the equation here go to a bigger picture story about local players just feeling like they don't need to take an official visit to Pitt. And it's interesting to me because, like I said, there were only 4 guys who have taken official visits to Pitt and not ended up signing with Pitt. Tyrese Fearbury in the 2022 recruiting class. Josh Rawlings out of Woodland Hills went to Virginia in the 2020 recruiting class. MJ Devonshire from Aliquippa went to Kentucky in the 2019 class. And Kalik Hudson, way back in 2016, went from McKeesport to Michigan. And those are the only 4 guys. Any other WPIAL players or Western PA players, City League, WPIAL, who have taken official visits to Pitt in the last 10 recruiting classes have ended up signing with Pitt. But almost all of them, save for 5, were already committed before they took their official visits. So DeMar Hamlin in the 2016 recruiting class committed after his official visit. If you remember that whole, the way that all went down into January and the night before signing day or the Monday night before signing day, he committed after his official visit. Dayon Hayes in 2020 recruiting class committed after his official visit. Cruz Brookins and Braylon Lovelace both committed on or after their official visits in the 2023 recruiting class, and ditto for Cam Lindsay, who committed, I think, at the end of his official visit 2 years ago, the 2024 recruiting class. Everybody else was committed before they took official visits. And this kind of plays into this bigger picture story of why local recruits just don't feel like they need to take an official visit to Pitt. And, we've harbored a theory or had a theory for a long time that, local recruits, why might they look more favorably on Pitt than, national recruits or recruits outside the area? Maybe local guys are just too close to it. Guys who grew up, somebody who's a senior in high school right now, or he's, finishing up his junior year of high school, he's 17 years old. You got to figure 10 years ago when he was 7, or we can even go a little bit, let's say 7 years ago, 8 years ago when he was, in middle school or kind of coming through middle school, he saw some Pitt that wasn't all that appealing, right? Like 2017 when they went 5-7, or the 2018 team when they won the Coastal, but, kind of didn't really impress anybody with their 7-7 record. 2019 was kind of an ugly 8-5. 2020 was a 6-5 season. And so they got to experience Kenny Pickett in the ACC championship, but a lot of it's surrounded by not really eye-popping seasons. And, if you're a local guy, you've probably been to a bunch of games at Acrisure Stadium. You probably went to the Southside facility a bunch of times. You might even be one of these guys who trains in the indoor facility. And it doesn't really stand out as all that interesting to you anymore because you've been around it a lot. I don't know if familiarity is breeding contempt in this case, but it's breeding disinterest. What do I have to see? Why do I need to take an official visit to Pitt? I already know what's there. So, I mean, like these guys, DeMar Hamlin, Dayon Hayes, Braylon Lovelace, Cruz Brookins, Cam Lindsey, these guys I'm talking about who came on their official visits not already committed. I mean, they were leaning pretty heavily that way to begin with. There haven't been many guys who have been on the fence about Pitt or leaning elsewhere who then took an official visit to Pitt. Local guys. Again, it's only 4. Khaleke Hudson, MJ Devonshire, Josh Rawlings, and Tyrese Fearbry. And that's it. And I think part of it is some of these local guys just have a feeling of like, what do I need to see? Why do I need to go there? I don't need to go take an official visit to Pitt. And I mean, at a certain point in the past, you could only take 5 official visits, so you had to be rather judicious about it. But now I think that limit has been lifted, so you can take as many as you want. It just makes more sense. Like, why wouldn't you take an official visit, even if it's close? I know you want to get a plane ride to some glorious exotic location like College Station or something like that, but like, why not take that official visit to Pitt and get an even closer look at the program? Because maybe you don't know all the things you already think you know. Maybe you're not as intimately familiar with the program as you think you are. But a lot of guys have chosen not to do that. All these guys that they have missed on over the years, I mean, it's been since the recruiting class of 2022. So it's been since the summer of 2021 that a WPIAL recruit has taken an official visit to Pitt and signed elsewhere. So it's almost like you're not getting a chance with some of these guys, which makes this year really interesting. That I think as many as 4 of these guys are going to take official visits to Pitt. Now, I don't necessarily think they're going to land all 4 of these guys. Jay Timmons and Lincoln Hoke and, Reston Lehman and Lucas Shanafelt. But I think they'll get a few of them, maybe as many as 2 or 3, or maybe as many as 3 out of the 4. It might settle in at 2. But either way, having these guys all interested enough to take official visits, I think is really interesting because it's an interesting development and change from what we've seen in recent years. Because if you look, like last year, the only WPIAL guy they signed was Shep Turk from Thomas Jefferson. He committed before his official visit. So technically they didn't get any official visits from the WPIAL where they had a chance to sway a guy and land his commitment. 2024, last year, the previous recruiting class, Julian Duggar, Ty Uhas, and Cam Lindsey. Lindsey was the only one of those 3 who wasn't committed when he took his official visit. But those are the only guys who were even here for official visits out of the local area. Same thing with 2023, Cruz Brookins and Braylon Lovelace. Like, nobody else even took an official visit. You're not even getting a look from those other guys. And so that's what I think makes this year kind of interesting, is because you are getting that look. You've gotten extended looks, multiple looks in the spring with these unofficial visits during spring camp, and then you're going to get another look in the summer with the official visits from all of these guys. And I think that's pretty interesting. I think it's pretty notable. It's a change, not an entire reversal, but a change from what we've seen with Pitt and Western PA recruits in recent years. Now, we'll see what ultimately comes of it. We'll see how many of these guys they land. And I don't think I need to rehash all the caveats I offered and disclaimers that I offered at the beginning of this thing. Because they obviously have to land guys from out of state too, and they're putting in some pretty good work with those prospects, players from Texas and Florida and Georgia and so on and so forth. But they've got an opportunity here maybe to do a little bit better in the WPIAL, and they're at least getting a look from these guys, which compared to recent years is kind of a step in the right direction. So we'll see if Pitt's fortunes improve when it comes to recruiting Western PA, but time will tell. All right, we'll be down in the South Side today for Pitt's spring practice. They'll practice this morning. We'll have a practice report later this morning. Then we'll have interviews, coaches and players, and full rundown of everything that happens at practice and what recruits are there and all that kind of stuff. So stay tuned to Panther-Lair.com for all the latest info on Pitt football, basketball, and recruiting, transfers, high schools, whatever's going on in the world of Pitt sports. We are covering it. Panther-Lair.com. And don't forget, right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Like this video and subscribe. That way you don't miss any of our Pitt video content. Thanks so much for tuning in today. I hope your week has gotten off to a great start. Enjoy your Tuesday. We'll catch up with you tomorrow for the Morning Pitt right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.